challenge in meeting their accreditation targets as they prepare for their first audits under the stricter, revised, broad-based Black Economic Empowerment Codes that came into effect on the 1st of May 2015. Many companies are scrambling to address the stricter codes before they undergo their annual BBBEE audits for 2016. Now, organizations with a turnover of more than 50 million rand a year must achieve a score of 40% in categories that have been deemed priority elements. They are ownership, skills development, and enterprise and supplier development. A company that fails to meet this threshold in just one of these elements will have its overall empowerment status drop by a level. Now, Saul Symanowitz joins us now in the studio to talk about this. He's a divisional manager at SABC 123. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you very much.
All right. Well, companies have realized that these new codes are here to stay, and they need to move very quickly in order to catch up and comply. But why have they been dragging their feet?
You know, I think when the revised codes were gazetted, and this was already in October 2013, there was a little bit of a wait-and-see attitude initially. Businesses were focused on the old codes to get their final audits out, and to some degree they didn't move quickly enough to ensure that what they needed to put in place for the revised legislation was put into place. And sort of as the audits approach, where they will be now assessed, most companies for the first time under the new codes, they are starting to play catch up to get their houses in order to ensure that they've done enough under the new codes to maintain their levels.
It's not the first time that we hear that there has been a lackluster approach towards compliance with BEE, especially with the first codes. What's making it difficult for them to comply? Is it a question of lack of transformation or refusing to transform? Is it intransigence?
You know, I think when any new legislation is introduced, there's always a bit of an adjustment. I mean, I've been in this game for quite a while, and I remember when the codes were introduced for the very first time in February 2007. And at that point in time, the attitude was, this is exceptionally difficult. How are we ever going to adjust our practices to ensure that we're able to comply with this legislation? And as time went on, it became part and parcel of doing business in South Africa, where the standards became sort of business practice. And I think we'll see the same thing with the new codes. I think there's been a little bit of a knee-jerk reaction where businesses are, obviously because the compliancy standards are much tougher than before, they similarly are sort of being taken a bit aback to say, well, this is much tougher than before. How are we going to be able to comply? But as time goes on, I think once again, the new codes, the revised legislation, will become part and parcel of business practice. I think just because it's so new, we are seeing lower levels of compliancy as businesses start to get audited for the first time, but that is not sustainable because businesses will start to lose business from other corporates, from the public sector, etc. So ultimately, I think businesses will revert back to the levels that we had seen previously.
Now, for an inspector who comes and audits a company, what must he look for him to say that a company is BEE compliant?
Okay, so the compliancy is based in terms of a scorecard. So it's a very objective measure. The scorecard has now under the new codes 5 different elements. And within those elements, so the 5 elements very quickly are ownership, which looks at whether there are black shareholders within the business. Management control looks at the demographics of the staff within the organization. Skills development looks at the commitment to skilling and training black people. Enterprise and Supplier Development, which looks at firstly who the business is procuring from and how transformed their suppliers are. Secondly, a new aspect called Supplier Development and Enterprise Development, which is the development simplistically of small black-owned businesses. And finally, socio-economic development, the commitment to uplifting people who previously weren't mainstream participants in the economy and bringing them into the economy. So the auditors or the verification professionals will conduct an audit in terms of the scorecard as to what the business has done. And within each of these 5 elements, there are sub-elements, and there are different targets that need to be achieved. and there are points available for the achievement of those targets. So essentially the auditor will look at what the business has done in terms of these elements and sub-elements, how many points they have achieved, and this will then translate into a certain status level. So depending on how many points you've scored, you will range either from a level 1, which is the highest level of compliancy, to a level 8.
What is the percentage
and
of
even
high compliance?
non-compliant.
What is the highest percentage of compliance?
So level 1 is when you score more than 100 points on your scorecard. Level 8, you need to achieve a minimum of 40 points under the new codes to be a level 8. Anything lower than 40 points, you're non-compliant.
Mm-hmm. Now, is it a black and white thing? Because I'm trying to get to this point due to the report that we heard last year that most of the time you find that in big corporate South Africa, there are many white people in the high echelons of management, and there is so much difficulty in terms of empowerment for black people to occupy senior executive positions. Is it difficult for us to actually move away from that paradigm so that we can be able to achieve a high level of balance in terms of the population dynamics of the country, given white people, black people, the colored community, as well as the Indian community?
So the element you're talking about is the management control element, which looks at, as I say, demographics of employees within organizations and at various levels, with a focus of course, more senior levels. A very interesting change that we've seen under the revised codes, under the new legislation, is the introduction of what they call EAPs, or economically active population targets. So under the old codes, when we talked about black people, it was a collective grouping, African, Indian and colored people who were South African citizens. So in the past, it made no difference within your demographic structure of your organization. For example, if you had a senior manager who was an Indian person or an African person, the same number of points would be scored on the codes. Now what the government is trying to ensure is that our workforces are not only kind of in terms of black and white, as you say, or black and non-black. They've segmented black people into 6 different race subgroups: African males and females, colored males and females, and Indian males and females. And now the targets that need to be achieved must be achieved in respect of each of those 6 different race subgroups, with different weightings. So based on the population demographic. So, for example, African people constitute a much higher percentage of the population, for example, than Indian people. So there will be a much higher target that needs to be achieved.
I get that point. Now that I'm running out of time, I just want you to repeat for me very, very briefly. For a company to speed up its scorecard for BEE or triple BEE compliance, according to the new codes, just very briefly, what is it that they must do to optimize that?
Okay, so I think there must be a greater commitment to transformation. I think without that, you're never going to see good positive scoring on the scorecard. And one needs to focus now on the priority elements, being ownership, skills development, and enterprise and supplier development. If there's not a focus on those 3 core areas, a business will never achieve good scoring.
Quite an interesting subject. We'll get deeper into the details in our future interview, but thank you very much for talking to us.
Thank you very much for having me.
All right, we are having there Saul Symanowitz, who is a regional manager at Sage BEE 123, talking to us right here on News Today. And of course, moving on.